At the start of 1848, James W. Marshall discovered gold at Sutter's Mill, and after that fateful day, hundreds of thousands of people came to California to dig for gold. These people were called the 49ers. The 49ers changed California into an agricultural and cultural center for this world. Today, there are three groups that I'm going to be focusing on: the Chinese, the African Americans, and the Chileans, and how they impacted the gold rush. After hearing about all the riches and happiness that came from California, Gamsan, as the Chinese called it, no wonder the Chinese wanted to leave the decaying China to come to the prospering California. The Chinese started to come to the start of the gold rush. By 1852, 200 plus thousand Chinese had made the long journey to California. The Chinese were originally welcomed with open arms, but as the gold supply in California started to become more and more scarce, the Chinese started to get hated on more and more. Eventually, the American miners started to pressure the government to drive away the foreigners. The government didn't do exactly that, but they made a law which forced foreign miners to pay a monthly fee in order to mine the land. This drove out many of the foreigners, but the Chinese stayed and paid the tax. Once the government and the Americans realized that this was not working, they started to actually force them to leave by doing horrendous things like beating them and cutting off sacred braids that the Chinese men had. They also burned their shacks and started to murder them. Even though they had to go through this much hate and resentment, the Chinese immigrants persevered and adapted to their environment. They started to lead the mines to open shops like restaurants, laundries, and other stores in the California cities. Chinese restaurants were called the best eating houses in San Francisco. So many Chinese settled in San Francisco that their neighborhood was called Chinatown, which is still the largest and oldest Chinese community in the US. Other Chinese used their farming skills from China to drain swamps and dig irrigation ditches to water dry fields in California's Central Valley. The Chinese didn't only settle in California, they settled all over the West Coast, and wherever they went, they brought arts, taste, scents, and stuff from one of the world's oldest cultures. As Americans continued to move west, they needed to build railroads. So the largest group of people working on building the railroads were the Chinese. Even though they worked longer and harder hours, they were still paid less than the white workers. The Chinese continued to come to America until 1882, when the U.S. passed a law that stopped them from immigrating to the U.S. This law was not cleared for a very, very long time. Like all people during the gold rush, African Americans came to California in search of gold. But the thing that made them different was that when African Americans came to California, they were also in search of refuge, a place away from slavery. African Americans had to deal with prejudice and hate like all other immigrants, even though they were not even immigrants. Even though California was nominally a free state, slavery still existed. To make it worse, in 1852, a law was passed that made it illegal for slaves to flee their masters around California borders. And to make it worse, one-third of the slaves in California were illegally enslaved. Even with these harsh conditions, African Americans adapted to the racist environment by working in integrated settings with the Chinese, Latin Americans, and Europeans. African Americans started to set up communities with other African Americans, and one of these were called Negro Hill, which was founded by two Massachusetts-born African Americans. After this, many of these small settlements started to pop up to accommodate the growing population of African Americans. Many other African Americans had more success giving services to the gold economy, like starting shops in many varieties. Another example would be of two newcomers with the names of Mifflin Gibbs and Peter Luster. They started the Pioneer Boot and Shoe Emporium, whose customers stretched out through the entire California. Slaves also bought their freedom with the gold that they mined, and such was the case of Alvin Coffey, when he convinced his owner to let him go to California and mine for gold to earn his freedom. And he did just that. He earned $7,000 from the gold fields and bought his freedom for himself and his family. African Americans left a great impact on the gold rush, and vice versa. African Americans have also created black communities in all of the cities that we know today in California. The Chileans wanted to leave their hard lifestyle back home and create a new life for themselves and their families in California. The Chileans had many challenges like all immigrants who came to California during the gold rush. One man with the name of Vicente Perez Rosales was an immigrant who came to California after failing to make money in Chile. Him and his business partners had some success, but not that much. He also had to deal with all the violence which was directed at foreign miners like himself. As a result of all this violence and hate, most of the miners eventually left the goldfields to go work on other adventures. All Chileans were not like Perez. Most of them adapted better to their environment and surroundings. All Chileans had to leave the gold mines after horrible injustices like murders, whippings, beatings, and mutilations became a way for Americans to get rid of the competition. But they adapted and settled in San Francisco and became successful people that did things like become businessmen, politicians, judges, legislators, and congressmen. Some even became so rich and powerful that they had some of the most prominent and wealthy families in all of the state. The Chileans left many legacies, but not as many as other foreigners, because a lot of Chileans eventually left to go back to Chile, but the majority decided to stay in urban cities like San Francisco and start a new life for them and their families, while bringing their cultural influences to the growing economy of California. And that's how these three groups impacted and affected the gold rush, and how they made California into a cultural center for the modern world. Thank you.